Richard is the son of Mexican immigrants. He grows up in a migrant camp in Southern California. At school, white classmates discriminate against him. They knock his food onto the ground. After his mother learns about it, she makes an extra burrito. She tells her son to share it with his classmates, to break the prejudice. The next day, while Richard is eating, the bullies come looking for him again. Richard raises the burrito and offers them a taste. The fat bully disgustedly tells his lackey to try it first. The boy reluctantly takes a bite. He is instantly blown away by the flavor and cannot stop eating. The fat bully wants to try the other burrito too, but Richard holds it down. The bully has no choice but to pay for it. From that moment on, the legend of Mexican burritos spreads rapidly among the students. The more burritos Richard brings to school, the more pocket money he earns. To buy chocolates for the girl he loves, Judy, he spends all of his savings. But the police mistake him for a thief and put him in handcuffs. Just because he is Mexican-American, he becomes a target of white police officers. Because of this, Richard drops out before finishing elementary school and turns to a life of crime. As an adult, Richard drifts through life without direction. He and his girlfriend, Judy, spend their days around gangs, living aimlessly. Everything changes when Judy gets pregnant. She seriously tells Richard that they must change for the sake of their child's future. Richard leaves the gang behind and tries to live an honest life through hard work. But even after their second child is born, the family still struggles badly. They can only give their children watered-down milk. Wanting to improve their lives, Richard applies for jobs everywhere. But because of his criminal record, he cannot even get hired as a security guard. He starts to lose hope. One day his child stands on a car, trying to fix a worn-out shoe. A white neighbor sees it and starts hurling insults at them. Richard burns with anger but stays silent. For the sake of his family, he swallows his pride and asks his former gang leader for help. The gang leader lets go of the past and soon brings Richard good news. Fritole needs a janitor. Richard takes the application form and nervously brings it home. He hesitates for a long time before filling it out. In the end, with Judy's encouragement, he finally submits the application. But the HR department wants to reject him again because of his criminal history. Desperate, Richard steps forward and promises he will work harder than anyone else. The company finally gives him a chance. As a janitor at the Fritole factory, his job is repetitive and boring every single day. But Richard still works with endless energy. His coworkers are shocked by his determination. While working, Richard begins studying how the machines operate. But when he asks a white engineer questions about them, he is mocked. Richard forces himself to stay calm because he knows this job is hard to get. One of the black engineers, named Beck, treats him politely on the surface. But after Richard asks questions about the machines, Beck simply walks away. At lunch, coworkers explain the factory's survival rules to Richard. The hierarchy inside the factory is strict. Even the seating arrangement is carefully divided. The people sitting in the front row are factory managers. They live comfortably and receive generous pensions. The second row belongs to floor managers. They have no job security, yet carry all the responsibility. Next to them sit the base operators, the most respected position in the factory. And Beck is the best among them. He arrives at the factory earlier than anyone every day. But even after 15 years, he still cannot move from a technical role into management. So a janitor at the very bottom has no right to speak with engineers. But Richard refuses to stay a janitor forever. Gathering his courage, he approaches Beck with Mexican burritos. He successfully wins him over through food. Richard begins asking questions about the machines, and even spots problems in time, warning Beck before things go wrong. Richard notices that when the oil temperature gets too high, the chips turn brown, so he tries to remind Beck to adjust the heat. But Beck says the brown chips are simply thrown away. Richard says that because of his brown skin, he has also suffered unfair treatment. For the first time, Beck truly relates to him. One day, Beck tells Richard that he has decided to take him as his apprentice. From then on, Richard arrives at the factory an hour early every day to learn from Beck. After work, he stays an extra hour for hands-on practice. Through relentless effort day after day, Richard wins Employee of the Month by the end of the month. But in 1984, America enters an economic recession. Richard's dream of promotion completely falls apart. Even his salary is heavily reduced. The Fritole factory also begins declining. By 1992, the factory starts laying off large numbers of workers to cut costs. Fritole President Roger asks the factory to play his motivational video, begging every employee to think like a president. The ignored video gives Richard hope once again. One day, Richard is eating grilled corn with his son. His son grimaces after tasting the spicy sauce on the corn, yet still keeps eating happily. Richard suddenly gets inspired and comes up with a way to save the factory. He wants to create spicy chips, so he buys several large bags of corn chips. Judy worries about their living expenses for the month, but after hearing Richard's plan, she still chooses to support him. To save money, Richard personally goes to Beck and tells him about his idea. After gaining Beck's support, Richard brings home discarded brown Cheetos from the factory. The family buys huge amounts of hot sauce and starts experimenting non-stop. At the time, many factories use chemicals, test tubes and syringes to create artificial chili flavoring. The spice level is stronger, but Richard believes authentic Mexican hot sauce creates the purest and most genuine flavor. The family travels through streets and neighborhoods, trying every kind of chili pepper they can find. Eventually, they create a flavor that is intensely spicy and addictive. Even though the experiment succeeds, the executives busy with layoffs do not care about a janitor's suggestion. Some even mockingly ask why he does not just call the president directly. So Richard searches for the headquarters phone number and calls the president in Italy himself. He successfully convinces Roger and gets an address to mail the samples. The couple sincerely sends Roger a huge box of samples. The moment the president tastes the first spicy Cheeto, he cannot stop eating. Before he even wipes his hands clean, he immediately calls Richard back and decides to personally inspect the factory in America. When the factory executives realize Richard caused all this, they publicly blame him in front of the entire company. If the president rejects Richard's idea and sees the factory continuing to lose money, he might pull all investments completely. That would mean the factory shutting down and every employee losing their job. Richard starts doubting himself because of the pressure. After returning home in disappointment, Judy learns what happened and constantly encourages him. She believes he will succeed. The couple even studies communication techniques together through books. On the day Roger visits the factory, Richard deliberately wears a proper suit. As soon as Roger arrives, he immediately calls Richard into the meeting room and asks him to present the product pitch. The scripted wording feels unnatural to Richard, so he decides to improvise. Holding up his spicy Cheetos, he passionately describes the flavor. When executives ask about the expected market share, Richard does not even understand the term, so he gestures using the shelf space in supermarkets. The executives burst into laughter at the sight. Then Richard explains how much ordinary people love spicy flavors. The president strongly agrees. Ignoring the factory director's objections, he decides to invest in the product. But after large batches of spicy Cheetos are produced, they fail to create a strong response. Instead, they become unsold products sitting on supermarket shelves. Because of this, the factory director decides to stop production. Richard is crushed and starts giving up on himself. But Beck believes Richard is underestimating himself and bluntly wakes him up. That night, Richard cannot sleep. While talking with his family, he realizes the factory never advertised spicy Cheetos at all. Richard suddenly has an idea. He reconnects with his former gang friends and hires them for a massive street promotion campaign. At the factory, Richard encourages everyone to believe in spicy Cheetos. The factory director tries to stop him, but Beck cuts him off directly. Everyone knows the chips taste amazing. As long as the promotion increases, the product will eventually explode in popularity. So Richard loads all the factory's spicy Cheetos onto trucks outside. Gang members begin handing out free samples across the streets. Richard and his family also rush to supermarkets, buying all the spicy Cheetos from the shelves. Whenever curious shoppers look over, they immediately start promoting the snack. Customers quickly become hooked. Soon, people across countless neighborhoods begin frantically buying spicy Cheetos. The first quarter sales report for spicy Cheetos reaches President Roger. Curious, he asks how much the factory director spent on advertising. When he learns the director spent absolutely nothing because of his prejudice against a janitor, he is stunned. Roger immediately places an order for 5 million bags. Overnight, the dying factory comes back to life. Every production line starts running together. Formerly laid-off workers are urgently called back overnight for overtime shifts. Finally, they complete the massive order. 6 months later, the factory returns to its peak scale. Richard still believes he is only a janitor, but when he goes to the second floor to clean, President Roger has already been waiting inside an office for a long time. Right in front of Richard, he inserts a business card with Richard's name on it into the office door. The title reads Marketing Director. In an instant, Richard transforms into Fritole's marketing director. Everyone starts applauding for him. Sitting in his own office, Richard calms himself down and immediately shares the good news with his wife. His dream finally comes true. He rises from nothing to become a Fritole executive. Today, Flamin Hot Chuttas has become a multi-billion-dollar brand. Richard and Judy's love story is equally inspiring.